they're always living in 1939, right? To show that you're a moral person, you have to stand on side of the victims who are the Jews. And now, yeah, okay, they were victims back in 1939, but they're not the victims now. It's just that you say, okay, you're very brave in your 1939 world, but in the world that exists now, you're on the wrong side. It just seems like they haven't woken up. Their morality is based um, on events that took place a long time ago and a certain interpretation of those events, but it's not based on the current reality, and that's not a and so it has caused them to actually, as you say, put themselves on the wrong side of history as it is being lived out before our eyes now.
The recent events have kind of ruined World War II for me. You know
Mm-hmm.
how I was, as a little kid, I was obsessed with World War II. I think you remember
Mm.
all these books I have, and it was just, and now it's just, World War II has been tainted. This great story, the good fight, the narrative that was always put about now we stopped Hitler. The whole history of the West. And I think this is kind of what I'm getting at a bit, is that I think what we're doing in our complicity in Gaza, I think is destroying everything about the Western world. Is that maybe
Yeah, well, I think it's certain.
hyperbolic? I mean,
I think it is. I mean, I think it really is eating away at the foundations. And again, you can see it more in the younger generation. Like in my generation, I wasn't part of, the obviously part of the generation that went and fought the war, but I grew up in the shadow of it, and it did certainly shape my view of the world, and it shaped everybody's view of the world. It was the defining event of the 20th century, and so people's sense of morality and of who the victims are and all that was really kind of um, was was determined, by the the story, of World War II. And now, we are. That was 80 years ago, and we have, the most recent generations are have grown up. They're no longer in that shadow. They do hear about it, but it's distant. And what they're more aware of, especially like people in their 20s now, is what's happening in Gaza now. And that's the reality that's actually defining their sense of the world and, let's say, geopolitical morality. So it is. I think it really is changing, and it is bringing about the end um, of that kind of very unusual set of circumstances that that create people with the thinking of Keir Starmer and Mertz and Trump, for that matter. They're products of the World War II generation. Even though they, again, like me, they grew up in its shadow, and it, that's just going to be 10, 20 years from now. I don't think you're going to find leaders like that anymore. And there is a real chance that that whole legacy that has been terribly abused. I mean, it was a real war, and I think the story that we're told about it is largely true. I think it can be embellished, and it's simplified. It wasn't quite so black and white. It was more shades of gray, but all in all, it was a good fight, and I in general agree with it. But it's that story of World War II was ended up being abused, and I think people now are seeing it, and like you, they're kind of developing just almost a revulsion towards it. I don't want to hear about it anymore. You're just using it to do terrible things now.
right. So, I mean, if this story is so much part of our identity and our history, and of us, just of our sense of morality, like you're saying, us being the good guys, the good fight. What's going to happen to the Western world when we realize that we are on the wrong side of history, that we're not the good guys? What happens? This isn't. It's different than just like a World War II, World War One, because you had an actual military defeat. You had millions of people dead, but we're seeing something different. We're seeing
Yeah.
the death of Western society via a proxy, without actual direct conflict of Western
Hmm.
European nations and the United States, Canada.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to say, because the thing is, um, it is that third pillar that we talk about, the soft power. It's not just important for the way the rest of the world looks at the West, but it's important within the West. The sense of we being on the right side of history. It kind of gives legitimacy to our own governments. And if that's really eaten away and then finally collapses, then that I think that tells you that the old order, the other two pillars, the economic and the military, really can't. They've been weakened too, But even without that, the legitimacy provided by the World War II narrative, um, the whole system, the Western system is really put in jeopardy. It's stripped of legitimacy, and all I can say is that I think it's going to, without pretending to know what it's going to lead to, it's going to open up Pandora's box because it's just, again, I tend to think back to China. It's like when the Qing dynasty fell, there was nothing really to replace it. So we had this period of warlords and various kinds of movements, and nothing really worked until, well, the communists were victorious. And then, we don't have to go too far down that road. But it's just that I think we're in I know things are very, very different, but it's sort of broadly similar. It's just that there is this crisis of legitimacy, and that just opens the door to all kinds of possibilities and just all sorts of different people. They can be political entrepreneurs, of various stripes, take advantage of the vacuum, and different ideologies arise, and we'll see where we're going. Maybe we see it like a one sort of precursor of this with the election of what's his name,
Hmm?
Rama.
Oh, Zoran Mandami, I
Zoran.
think. Yeah,
So, okay, I
or
remember his
something like
first
that.
name. I'm terrible with names. Forgive me. Yeah, but his election is an outright socialist. And he's talking about real socialist measures. That wasn't possible in the U.S. For the last century. That's something like that. There was a real socialist movement back in the very early part of the 20th century that did have a real following, but we haven't seen anything like that again. I think it's because, this lack of legitimacy is just like, okay, there was sort of this, this habit of just basically supporting the establishment. We have a system that works. Maybe we want to tinker with it at the edges. So I'm going to vote Democrat or I'm going to vote Republican, whatever. But neither side is going to make any sort of drastic change. And, you still see that in Europe. It's just like even as places like Germany start to fall apart, you still have the majority of people just think they can't conceive of voting for, somebody who's really outside of the system. But I think we're going to see more and more things that similar to what we've seen in New York City, where people actually will go outside the system. We've already seen, in some ways Trump he's not really outside of the system, but but he's got a foot, he does outside of it, one foot in it, he is not truly the establishment's favorite candidate, but he's clearly being, I think, controlled. And in the end, the establishment has learned to work with him and to kind of contain him. But we're going to see more and more candidates like this, and we're going to see political movements that really challenge the whole system, that are not just making, adjustments at the edges.
Right. Yeah, I think it's interesting because we have, Zoran on the left, the socialist side, and then we have Thomas Massey, kind of the counterweight to that as well. I think both of these are kind of rejections normal political parties, and also both of them reject the Israelis' lobby influence in the United States. They're not Israeli firsters. That's a defining pillar, I think, of their platform. So both of them are getting a lot of support. I know, was it Elon Musk is throwing his weight behind Thomas Massey because Trump is after Thomas Massey. He saw that tweet. He's a very bad guy. I mean, say what you want about Thomas Massey. He's not a bad guy.
Yeah.
And he's very
AIPAC
principled.
is after him too. They've
Right.
put the, right.
Well, I imagine
targeted
AIPAC
him.
sent, I guess Trump is mad about the big, beautiful bill, but probably also
Right.
getting pressure from AIPAC.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, so it's an interesting time. We'll see just, yeah, politically, I think throughout the West, I believe you're right. We're going to see some chaos, some strange ideas, and like I said, political entrepreneurs, people will rise up and spout their ideas, and maybe that's what we need. I'm sure there'll be a lot of failed experiments, but hopefully we can find something that works well, and understand like what we did, learn from all of our mistakes here in the past. But yeah, I sometimes think I think it's normal for people always to think that they're living through some pivotal time. And there's always wants to have this some type of self-importance. Um, but I think that what we're living through now, it truly, truly is. It's not something
Hmm.
that we just think it is, because
Yeah.
it's something I think you told me at the very beginning when we started these conversations was um, how Western dominance has been around for 500 years. 500 years of sort of Western civilization leading the charge. But now it has fundamentally changed. Can you kind of explain and expound on that, just sort of the gravity of what it is that we're living through?
Yeah. Okay. I think that's true. It's just there. The main challenge is you have to say, well, Russia, China, and the global South. You know, you could put it in those terms. And first of all, just looking at Russia briefly, it's just Russia has been, I guess it's since like the end or the beginning of the 18th century, basically. So even the late 17th under Peter the Great. So we're going back, not quite 500 years, but 400 years, 350 years, let's just say something like that. That Russia has been really obsessed with the West and has been oriented towards the West, has seen its future as being with the West. Um, and even the Soviet period, they obviously there was the Iron Curtain, but the Warsaw Pact was part of the West, and that was part of the Soviet alliance. And Marxism, Leninism is something that came from the West too. So even though it was, there was this the Cold War, there still was that fundamentally a Western orientation. But that is just over. It's because of the sanctions and the hostility that was obviously preceded the SMO, but just accelerated after the SMO. Russia has turned east, and it looks like they have really given up on the West. It's not like they're just hoping that this is a temporary spat and they can back. That's what Putin's saying. It's just, look, guys, it's over. It's just like this is going to be for decades. So they're looking east. They're looking to China and India. So this is again, one of the great powers of the world has turned away from the West, and I think that's geopolitically an event of tremendous significance. It's a huge geopolitical earthquake, and we haven't seen anything like that again for centuries. And then China, is I think above all is just the fact that China is become the world's greatest manufacturing power, and then I think in terms of purchasing power parity, it's the largest economy in the world. Its economic significance is huge, and it really is the largest economy, and has surpassed the U.S. Now, when China went on this path of economic development, beginning with Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s, there was a real hope in that and a belief, I think, a confidence. I think it was part of Western smugness that they're just going to become like us. So this is what we need to just, we will encourage trade and whatever, and over time, they'll just be integrated in the system, and they'll just be part of the of our, of the Western system, essentially. But that's not what's happened. It's that China, though has taken advantage of the trade opportunities and is doing very well as a part of the international, economic system. It has stuck to its own political path, and so again, this is something of huge geopolitical consequence. So, you have this enormous economic power, and because it's such a great economic and technological power, it is therefore a great military power. And they are not part of the Western camp. And in fact, they are beginning, it seems like with every passing year, they increase their lead in economic terms and probably in military terms as well. So this is right there you see the beginning of the end of Western dominance. And then there's just what is the global South, and I'll just include India and Indonesia and Africa and the rest of Asia. They're all part of that, and most of those countries were really looked to the West, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union. That's where you say, okay, that's the center of power. We need to cooperate with these people. We need to align ourselves with them. But um, but now that the facts have changed, they see what's happened with Russia and they've seen what's happened with China. They understand that they live in a new world. And so they are not necessarily just abandoning the West and, becoming firm allies of China and or Russia, but they have completely changed their orientations where, they say, okay, well, we'll cooperate with the West where we can. But it's important to be working with these people. And so they're no longer these firm allies, but they're neutral countries, or maybe like Azerbaijan or something. They're playing two sides, the two sides against each other. So it's a very different landscape, geopolitical landscape now that we have, and the West still insists on having this hegemony, but you can see that they really, to a great extent, have lost it already, and the trends are for increasing diminution of Western hegemonic power.
Yeah, when we talk about this Western dominance for 500 years, this is, would you say that that's truly an anomaly where there was sort of some type of global hegemon where a Western power in some shape or form, whether it's the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, French, British, and finally the Americans, that sort of engage in this type of imperialism and this type of attempt for global hegemony. That in itself is just an anomaly. But prior to that, there wasn't really the technological capacity for anything like this, right?
Right.
So what the Western world, everything we know about the Western world the past 500 years that's really shaped us is kind of falling apart, right? Like this has been so much part of the Western identity. And now it's over, but maybe we can go back to being normal again. But I
Right.
wonder if we can, because 500 years of this type of history is it kind of difficult? I'm just wondering,
Right.
like,
Well, it does seem to be difficult. That's it. And clearly, the elites in these countries just clearly are having trouble, abandoning this mindset. It seems to be, it's hard for them to look at the world in any other way. It seems clear to me. Um, maybe some people understand that, okay, the economics have changed and we need to adjust accordingly, but they still have this, at least a sense of moral superiority. Um, and they're very reluctant to give it up. It just seems to me that it's become who they are. And I think it's just going to take a new generation that maybe really does understand and has grown up in this new world and understands that we do live in this new world and we have to act accordingly. That new generation has to replace them. You just don't see any signs from the leadership in the West that they get it, or they're even able to recognize the new reality.
I think what was surprising to me was to see that this type of thinking truly existed, because the language that the Western world always used was that kind of like, we are in a multipolar world. Look at all the diversity we have around the world and all these independent countries.
Right.
And you look at a map, you don't see the United States encroaching on people's territories. You just see the globe, like everybody's happy here. And then you start to learn about, oh, okay, it's a little bit more nefarious, this, international rules-based order and all these different NGOs and color revolutions and NATO and all these organizations for imperial control. It's the same thing, but we just did it in a sneakier way, more or less.
Yeah. No, it's not like, it's true. It's not like empires in the past that were really about direct territorial control. But yeah, we have at least 800 military bases around the world. And then more importantly, probably these NGOs and just various means of keeping countries in line. And these countries over the years have learned that, okay, you just have to do what the U.S. says. And they have been losing their independence. And then those countries that resist, like Iran, learn the hard way that yeah, it isn't such a happy multipolar war. It's sort of like you're allowed to have your. It's sort of you find it like multiculturalism within the West too. It's just that okay, yeah, it's wonderful if they wear different clothes and they eat different foods or whatever, but they basically have to, bow down to our ideology and our fundamental, interests. And yeah, that seems to be the deal. And then for any country like Iran that says no, no, we're just going our own way, then they find out, oh, um, yeah, it's really isn't about diversity. It's it's about hegemony. And the Chinese and so many other countries, obviously the Russians have all found this out and really understand this now. I think maybe all of them were kind of, maybe to some extent, were um, bought into the rhetoric that that described, but they found out that that's just rhetoric. If you don't toe the line, you will suffer. It becomes in real ways, yeah, very, very real ways.
Yeah, no, it's amazing just how much effort we put into it. All these countries, all these NGOs, how many people are working on trying to maintain U.S. primacy, global hegemony. I mean, has to be an incredibly expensive task. But this type of imperialism it's not the same as when we look back what the British did or anything like this, the Dutch, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there was a lot of trade, controlling routes. We're not even extracting resources. We're just spending so much money to try to make people like us, to overthrow governments which it just has the opposite intended effect. This is what's so strange about the United States form of imperialism. It's almost like it's imperialism that doesn't serve the empire. It doesn't. It's not. It's not making the empire richer. I mean, the whole point of having an empire, right, is so that you can extract resources from
Yeah,
all over the globe.
right. Yeah. No, I know a lot of people on the left will argue that because that's, the traditional leftist understanding of Western hegemony. And it was true to a great extent of earlier colonial systems. But I agree, with few exceptions, this is actually not to our benefit, but to our detriment. I guess you can say that sometimes it's to the benefit of people in the elite, or corporations that get certain contracts or whatever. But that when you look at our overall economy, no, it is weakened us. It is the money is flowing out to support these various efforts and mechanisms of control. Um, and it would be a good thing for us. Again, as we've said, we don't hate America. We want actually America to become a normal country and to give up the stream of global hegemony. And I think America can prosper if that's what we do. It'll do much better than it's doing right now.
Yeah, the empire is bankrupting us. Did the previous empires, did they bankrupt themselves? Or did they see a lot of prosperity initially? I imagine, right? I mean, like with the British and India and all this, I mean, it's got to be
Yeah.
very beneficial.
Well, yeah, actually, I'll just be honest. It's been a while since I've read those histories, so I couldn't give you a figure. Um, I think in the end, it's just like it's similar to like what happened, for example, in the South. You say that slavery in the end was actually not a very efficient economic institution. And I know there's a great deal of controversy over that, but my understanding that it really wasn't, and it wasn't even really to the benefit of the South in the long run. But so I would just kind of analogize that to other forms of control. I think it really is about control, more than anything. Yeah, sometimes there are economic benefits. I think clearly there are, but a country that just freely engages in trade actually minimizes its own costs, and free trade is that's conducted to the benefit of both parties enriches both sides. I think that's really true. I guess I'm with the free market people on that. So these systems, yeah, I think you can probably point to their times when, yeah, they really did extract, but it's an expensive way to extract resources. Let's say free trade is actually a much more efficient and less costly way of doing that, and to do it without violence and in a way that actually benefits both parties. So I think it's a mistake. It's just like, people have said that, well, the Iraq War was about oil, and maybe to some extent it was. But it was hugely expensive, conquering this country, and it cost a great deal in both blood and treasure. And yes, we got some of our oil companies maybe got some contracts or whatever, but it would have been so much easier in the end, so much more cost effective, simply to trade with them.
Yeah, for sure. The U.S., we weren't started out as a nation with an imperialist mindset. It's a rather recent phenomenon, but it's the
Yeah.
only, America that I know today. Well, when did it become all about U.S. primacy and global hegemony?
Right. Well, I think it really was following the Civil War, and especially in the early
The Civil
20th
War?
century. Yeah, following the Civil War that we
That we
started. 'Cause
started caring about primacy that
yeah,
long
well,
ago?
okay, well, you had the first real, let's say, in imperialist. Teddy Roosevelt, I think is. So this is a couple of decades a few decades after the Civil War, but around the turn of the century, with Teddy Roosevelt, and we seized the Philippines and Cuba and so on. It was the beginning that we started to play the imperial game and to gain our own possessions. That was but I think it did grow out of the Union victory in the Civil War. We began to see ourselves not as, not in the traditional way as, a republic. We began to develop an imperial mindset, and it took concrete form under Teddy Roosevelt. But that was, a stint. Again, it was limited, and there was opposition to it. I believe it was even Mark Twain that was part of the Anti-Imperial League. There were many intellectuals that opposed it, and and then of course there was our expansion of our own territory. Seizing territory from the Indian tribes. That was a kind of imperialism, but it really was when we began to see that to look at the whole globe as as the whole globe as a potential, let's say, colony of the United States. That began really after World War II. That was a post-World War II legacy because, of course, the British really had been retired from that. One of the important outcomes of that war is that, we demonstrated our power, and the British were clearly, a power inferior to us. And we kind of began to fill the British shoes and, establish bases around the world, and then began to see with the beginning of the Cold War that we were the ones that had to, defend the free world and make the world safe for democracy and that kind of thing.
Is there any way to wind down global hegemony
Well, yeah.
peacefully?
Yeah, well, I mean, there is. You really can. Um, I guess, the fear is, and I think maybe some of these people really have this fear. It's like if we pull out, then chaos will ensue. It's just like we're the ones that are kind of keeping the peace, just like the Romans had their Pax Romana. There's a Pax Americana, the American peace, because now we've shown that that's just not true. So many of the wars that have because of, American imperial ambitions. So it just isn't true. But you could say in some cases, like if we do pull out of certain regions, wars could ensue. It's not, it's not like that that is some sort of age of peace that will necessarily ensue. But we have to do it for our own sake, and then just you have to look at the policy in general has just had horrific consequences. I don't think we have to idealize the multipolar world to understand that this hegemonic world needs to end before it really leads to the destruction of the planet.